In 1880, the Cradle was the most dangerous place in America. Nearly 1 in 4 Bobbies never saw their first birthday. For a mother on the frontier, kneeling before that empty cradle on Christmas Eve, that statistic was a living hell. But her story, and the miracle that followed, reveals a hidden truth about how we survive the unbearable. Her name was Sarah. In the silent, snowbound expanse of the Dakota Territory, the death of her infant son felt less like a tragedy and more like a verdict. Isolated and hollowed by grief, she had no community, no church group, no safety net. Just the howling wind and an empty crib. But 70 miles away, a man she'd never met was about to hear of her loss. And what he did next would challenge everything we think we know about survival on the frontier. The winter of 1882 was a razor. It cut across the Dakota plains with a wind that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs and kill a newborn in a drafty cabin in a single night. Sarah and her husband, Henry, had arrived the previous spring, full of the brittle hope that built homesteads on stolen land. They filed their claim, built a single-room cabin with their own hands, and by August, Sarah was expecting. They were building a future, one log, one seed, one prayer at a time. But the frontier was a system designed to break people. The government's Homestead Act offered 160 acres to anyone who could survive 5 years on it. What it didn't offer was a doctor within 50 miles, a neighbor within 10, or protection from the sheer statistical certainty of loss. When Sarah went into labor 2 weeks early during a December blizzard, Henry was 40 miles away in Bismarck, trading furs for the flour and salt they needed to last until spring. She was alone. The baby, a boy they'd planned to name William, lived for 3 hours. The cause was likely what settlers called crib death or childbed fever, terms that were really just acknowledgments of medical ignorance. Sarah wrapped his tiny body in her one good blanket and placed him in the handmade pine cradle Henry had finished just days before he left. For 2 days, she sat beside it in the frigid cabin, the fire nearly out, unable to perform the simple act of burying her child in ground frozen solid as iron. 70 miles to the west, in a sheltered valley, a rancher named Thomas McCullough was doing the hard math of winter survival. He ran over 200 head of cattle on a spread 3 times the size of Sarah's claim. At 38, he was a widower of 5 years, a man whose own well of grief had run deep and then quiet. On December 23rd, he sent his 2 ranch hands, brothers named Elias and Joseph, to Bismarck for a final load of supplies and the latest newspapers. When the brothers returned on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, they brought more than sacks of coffee and nails. They brought a piece of news, passed from a freighter who'd heard it from the storekeeper in Bismarck. A homesteader's wife, alone on a claim near Silver Creek, had lost her newborn. The husband was still away. The woman was said to be in a bad way. Thomas listened to this report while mending a harness in his barn. He asked no questions. He simply laid down his awl and walked to the house. But here's what the brothers didn't know. Thomas McCullough had lost a child, too. A daughter, stillborn, followed 2 years later by his wife, Eleanor, from a fever no frontier remedy could touch. His own cradle, carved from oak for that hoped-for daughter, had been stored in his attic for half a decade, a monument to a future that never was. Without a word of explanation to his confused hands, Thomas climbed to the attic. He dusted off the oak cradle, its joints still solid, its rockers smooth. He then walked to his root cellar and began loading a wagon, a ham, sacks of potatoes and beans, a jar of preserves his housekeeper had put up, a side of bacon, a tin of coffee. He added a bundle of seasoned firewood, knowing a grieving person would let a fire die. He worked with a methodical, urgent silence. Elias, the older brother, finally stood in the doorway. "Boss, it's near sunset. A storm's brewing in the northwest. You'll never make it to Silver Creek and back tonight. The roads are drifted over." Thomas didn't stop loading. "I'm not coming back tonight. You're going to stay out there, in this, for strangers." Thomas finally looked at him. She's not a stranger. She's a mother who just buried her child in a snowdrift because the earth won't take him. He threw a heavy buffalo robe into the wagon, harnessed the bays, they're the strongest. This was the hidden economy of the frontier, never written in any ledger. It wasn't about money or barter. It was a calculus of shared risk. Thomas had surplus, food, wood, a cradle. Sarah had a deficit of catastrophic proportions. In a world without institutions, the only social safety net was the conscience of the nearest person who could hear the cry. And Thomas had heard it, relayed across 70 miles of frozen prairie like a chain of human telegraph. As the wagon rolled out of the ranch yard, the first flakes of a new storm began to swirl. Joseph made the sign of the cross. Elias just shook his head. The temperature was dropping fast, the wind picking up. The journey to the Silver Creek claim, manageable in fair weather, was now a gauntlet of invisible dangers. A broken wheel in a deep drift, a wrong turn in the blinding white, a horse going lame, any one of them would be a death sentence. Thomas pushed the team hard, following the fatting trace of the Bismarck Road east. The light failed quickly. Soon he was navigating by memory and the desperate feel of the wind, the wagon creaking and groaning through ever-deepening snow. The cradle, wrapped in oilcloth, rattled softly with every jolt. Inside his gloves, his fingers grew numb. He thought of his Alina. He thought of the tiny, still form of his daughter. He knew the shape of the silence that now filled Sarah's cabin. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a deafening one, crowded with the ghost of every lullaby that would never be sung. Back in her cabin, Sarah had reached the end of a terrible logic. With the last of her strength, she had moved the empty cradle to the center of the room. She knelt before it, not in prayer but in surrender. The storm outside mirrored the one within. She was out of food, nearly out of fuel, and utterly out of hope. The frontier had won. It had taken her child, it would likely take her husband on his return journey, and now it would take her. To die here on Christmas Eve felt like the final, cruel punchline. But at that exact moment, something cut through the wail of the wind. A different sound, a slow, rhythmic squeaking and crunching, the sound of wagon wheels compacting snow. Then the deep, blowing snort of exhausted horses. Sarah didn't move. She was convinced it was a hallucination, a final trick of a broken mind. A heavy knock shook her door, then another, and a man's voice, rough from the cold and the wind, called out. "Hello, the house. My name is Thomas McCullough. I'm a neighbor. I've come. I've heard of your loss." The door, warped by cold, did not budge. Inside, Sarah remained frozen, a statue of grief, unable to believe the world could still produce such a sound. Outside, Thomas stood in the driving snow, the fate of his entire mission, and perhaps 2 lives, hanging on whether a door would open or stay shut forever. The door opened, not with a welcome, but with the slow, mechanical yield of something broken. Sarah stood there, her form illuminated by the single candle behind her. She didn't speak. She just stared at the stranger in the snow, her eyes holding a vacancy that was more terrifying than tears. Thomas didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past her, not with force, but with the absolute certainty of a man who knew that in this cold, hesitation was a form of violence. He went straight to the hearth. The fire was a single coal beneath a mound of ash. He knelt, using wood he'd brought in from the wagon, and rebuilt it with the skill of someone for whom fire was life itself. As the flames began to crackle and light the room, he worked in silence, unpacking his provisions onto the rough table. The ham, the beans, the coffee, the jar of preserves that glowed like a ruby in the new light. Sarah watched from the doorway, a statue slowly thawing in the rising heat, her confusion palpable. Finally, he brought in the last item, still wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it on the floor near the hearth and unwrapped it with a care that bordered on reverence. The oak cradle emerged, its wood glowing in the firelight, the craftsmanship obvious in every smooth curve and tight joint. It was an object of profound beauty, utterly alien in the barren cabin. Sarah made a sound then, a sharp, wounded intake of breath. She took a stumbling step forward, her hand outstretched not to touch the cradle, but as if to ward it off. "Why?" The word was a scrape of raw sound. "Why would you bring that here?" Thomas stood, his shadow huge on the wall. "Because you need to know it can hold something again," he said, his voice low. "And because I needed to know I could let it go." He didn't tell her his story then. He fed her instead. He sliced the ham, heated the beans, made strong coffee. He placed the food before her and stood back, turning his attention to securing the cabin against the storm, checking the chinking in the logs as if giving her privacy to eat. It was only when she had taken a few bites, her body obeying a primal need her mind had forgotten, that he spoke again. My wife's name was Alina. We lost our daughter, Mary, before she drew a full breath. That cradle held nothing but hope, and then it held nothing at all. Sarah stopped eating. She looked from the cradle to his face, seeing the lines of shared loss etched there. The fortress of her isolation cracked just a fraction. "You didn't have to come," she whispered. "Yes, I did," he said, sitting across from her. "On the frontier, grief is a luxury you can't afford alone. It'll kill you as sure as the cold. It's a weight that takes two to carry." This was the unspoken rule of the plains. While the myth celebrated the solitary pioneer, the reality was a fragile web of whispered news and unasked-for aid. This network was the real government, the real church, the only thing standing between a family and oblivion. For the next hour, Thomas worked while Sarah slept, exhausted by the simple act of eating. He banked the fire, tended to his horses in the lean-to, and brought in enough wood to last 2 days. He found the small, wrapped bundle that was her son, and with a respect that required no words, moved it to a shelf, covering it with a clean cloth. He did not move the empty pine cradle. That was not his to touch. When Sarah awoke, the cabin was warm, the smell of coffee permanent in the air. She saw the covered bundle, saw the full wood box, saw the stranger sitting quietly by the fire, whittling a stick. A profound, disorienting shame washed over her. "You've done too much. I have nothing to give you." Thomas didn't look up from his whittling. "You're wrong. You're bearing witness. That's the currency out here. You see what happens and you remember. And when you hear of someone else's loss in a year or in 5, you'll understand the weight of it. And maybe you'll be the one to hitch a wagon." He was describing the compound interest of compassion, the only sustainable economy in a land of constant deficit. But the storm outside was escalating into a true blizzard. The wind screamed around the cabin corners, and snow began to seep under the door in fine, relentless powder. Thomas realized the obvious. He wasn't leaving tonight. And with the drifts piling up, he might not leave tomorrow. They were now bound together, not just by circumstance, but by the weather's verdict. This created a new, delicate tension. A man and a woman, strangers, alone in a cabin for an indeterminate time. Every social convention screamed against it. Thomas solved it by retreating into protocol. He announced he would sleep in the lean-to with the horses. Sarah, her frontier practicality overriding propriety, refused. "You'll freeze. The floor by the fire is yours." They established territories. He would stay on the west side of the hearth, she on the east near her bed. A line of firewood between them became a symbolic border. The first night passed in fitful quiet. The second day, the storm raged unabated. They spoke in fragments of crops, of cattle, of the relentless wind. He learned Henry was a carpenter by trade, lured west by the promise of land. She learned he'd lost Alina to a fever modern medicine could have cured. They were mapping the contours of each other's tragedy, finding the familiar shapes. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. A blinding, silent white world greeted them. The wagon was a smooth mound. The path to the road was gone. They were marooned in an ocean of snow. Thomas knew his ranch hands would be worried, but he also knew they'd trust his judgment. Sarah's terror, however, refocused. "Henry, he'll be trying to come home. He'll be out in this." Thomas studied the sky. It was clear and brutally cold. If he's smart, he's holed up in Bismarck. If he's a husband, he's trying to get home. He made a decision. "I'll take one of the horses and break a trail toward the main road. If he's coming, I'll find him. If not, I'll get word to my ranch that I'm all right." Sarah's eyes widened. "You can't, it's miles if you get lost." "I won't get lost." His certainty was absolute. He prepared the stronger of his 2 bay horses, bundling himself in the buffalo robe. As he mounted, he looked down at Sarah in the doorway. "Keep the fire. Don't let it die. I'll be back with your husband or with news." He turned the horse and plunged into the deep snow, beginning the arduous task of trail breaking. For Sarah, his departure felt like a second abandonment. The cabin, once a tomb of grief, had in 3 days become a sanctuary of shared burden. The silence that returned was different now. It was an anxious waiting, not a hollow ending. She paced, she tended the fire, she stared at the two cradles, the rough, empty pine one and the beautiful, empty oak one. They were like two questions she couldn't answer. Thomas's journey was a brutal test of endurance. The horse lunged through chest-high drifts, sweating and steaming in the cold. He followed the remembered line of the creek, the only reliable landmark. After 2 hours of grueling progress, he saw a dark spot against the white about a half-mile ahead. A figure moving slowly. A man on foot leading a limping horse. Thomas urged his bay forward. As he neared, he saw the man was near the end of his strength, stumbling, his face a mask of frost and exhaustion. It was Henry. His horse had put a foot in a prairie dog hole, snapping its leg. Henry had been forced to shoot it and continue on foot, carrying only a small pack. Henry looked up as Thomas approached, his eyes bleary with cold and despair. He fumbled for the pistol at his belt. "Henry," Thomas called out, his voice cutting the frozen air. "My name is Thomas McCullough. Sarah is safe. I've come to bring you home." Henry froze, the pistol half drawn. The words didn't seem to register. "Sarah. Alive, warm, in your cabin. I've been with her for 3 days. Thomas dismounted, approaching slowly. "Let's get you on this horse." The story tumbled out of Henry as Thomas helped him onto the bay. The frantic ride from Bismarck, the storm hitting, the horse's injury, the long, hopeless trek through the blizzard, convinced with every step he would find his wife dead. When Thomas told him of the baby's fate, Henry broke down, sobbing into the horse's mane. But when Thomas mentioned the cradle, the oak cradle he'd brought, Henry's head snapped up. "You brought a cradle?" he asked, confusion cutting through his grief. "I did," Thomas said simply, leading the horse back along the broken trail. "It was gathering dust. It needed a purpose." They arrived at the cabin as the late afternoon light turned the snow blue. Sarah, hearing the horse, threw the door open. The reunion was wordless, a crushing embrace in the doorway, a storm of tears and muffled apologies. Thomas busied himself with the horse, giving them their moment. Inside, Henry saw the transformation, the fire, the food, the order. And then he saw the oak cradle by the hearth. He walked to it and ran a trembling hand over the smooth headboard. He looked at Thomas, then at Sarah, and the understanding of what this object represented, its journey from one man's attic of grief to the center of their own, overwhelmed him. He wept again, but this time with a gratitude that was humbling to behold. That night, for the first time, they shared a meal as three. Henry told of his journey. Thomas shared more of his life on the ranch. A plan began to form. Thomas would stay another day to help Henry get the homestead in order, then he would return to his own spread. In the spring, they would meet properly, neighbor to neighbor. But as they talked, a new sound echoed across the snowy plain, not the wind, a long, low howl, then another from a different direction, and another, wolves, a large pack driven by the deep cold and desperate hunger. Their calls circled the cabin, closer than they should have dared. The horses in the lean-to snorted and stomped in fear. Thomas and Henry exchanged a glance. The crisis of grief was over. The crisis of survival had just entered a new, more primal phase. The wolves had caught the scent of vulnerability, of horses, of humans, of meat. They were out there in the dark, closing the circle. And inside, the firelight that had been a symbol of hope now felt like a beacon, drawing the hungry eyes of the wilderness right to their door. In the sudden silence that followed the wolf calls, Thomas moved with a calm that was more terrifying than panic. He didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he went to the cabin's single small window and blew out the candle, plunging the room into firelight. "They're not here for us," he said, his voice flat. "They're here for the horses, and if they get the horses, we're dead. Not tomorrow, by spring." He was articulating the brutal hierarchy of frontier survival. The horses were their only link to the outside world, their only means of getting more supplies, of getting Henry to paid work, of fleeing if necessary. Without them, they were 3 people in a food-lined coffin. Thomas's 2 bays and Henry's surviving mare were in the flimsy lean-to, a structure meant for shade, not defense. Henry, galvanized by a tangible threat, shook off his exhaustion. What do we do? Thomas was already loading his rifle. We make them choose a different meal ticket. He handed Henry his pistol. You watch the window. If they get past me and go for the door, you shoot. Don't wait. Sarah, keep the fire high. We need the light. He opened the cabin door just enough to slip out, closing it silently behind him. The cold was a physical blow. The moon, reflecting off the snow, cast a blue, ghostly light. He could see them, 6, maybe 7 dark shapes moving at the tree line 50 yards away. Their eyes glinted like chips of ice. They were assessing, circling, looking for weakness. Thomas didn't fire. A single shot might scatter them, or it might ignite a frenzied attack. He moved to the lean-to, speaking in a low, steady voice to the terrified horses. He untied them, leading them out into the open snow, putting himself between the animals and the woods. He was making himself the obstacle. The wolves paused. A large gray male, the pack leader, took a few steps forward, lips curled back. Then a crack from the cabin. Henry, from the window, had fired a warning shot over their heads. It was the wrong move. The report shattered the tense standoff. The gray wolf lunged not at Thomas but at the nearest horse, a bay. Thomas's rifle came up in one fluid motion. He fired. The shot caught the wolf in the shoulder, spinning it into the snow with a yelp. The other wolves scattered back into the trees. But the wounded wolf wasn't finished. It rose, snarling, blood darkening its fur. It fixed its eyes on Thomas. The horses reared and pulled, their whites showing. Thomas worked the lever on his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round, his breath plumbing in the cold air. He aimed, not at the body, but at the narrow space between those glowing eyes. The second shot echoed, sharp and final. The wolf dropped. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining wolves had vanished. Thomas stood there for a full minute, scanning the tree line, his rifle ready. Then, slowly, he led the trembling horses back into the lean-to and secured them. He dragged the wolf's carcass by the hind legs far away from the cabin, leaving a crimson trail in the snow, a message. When he came back inside, his face was grim. They'll be back. Maybe not tonight, but they know we're here now, and they're hungry enough to remember. The immediate threat was over, but the psychological siege had begun. They took shifts watching the window for the rest of the night, the rifle and pistol always within reach. The shared danger forged a bond of a different, harder metal. They were no longer just a grieving couple and a compassionate stranger. They were a garrison under siege. The next morning, under a harsh, clear sky, Thomas knew he had to leave. His own ranch, his livestock, his men, they would be facing their own struggles. But leaving Sarah and Henry felt like abandoning a post. Before he left, he did a thorough assessment of the homestead's vulnerabilities. The lean-to was inadequate. The cabin's chinking needed more work. Their food supply, while bolstered by his gifts, was not infinite. He sat with Henry at the table, drawing a rough map in the ash from the hearth. You see this ridge here, 2 miles west? That's the boundary of my spread. My line shack is just on the other side. If you're in trouble, if the wolves come in a big pack, if someone gets sick, if you run out of food before spring, you go there. There's a cache. Food, ammunition, blankets, it's yours. Consider it an advance against the future. Henry stared at the map, then at Thomas. An advance for what? For when you're on your feet, for when you have a surplus. You'll pay it forward, not back to me, but to the next person who needs it. Thomas was formalizing the unwritten code. He was turning a moment of compassion into a sustainable system. He then did something extraordinary. He went to the oak cradle and from his pocket took a small, finely made metal tag on a leather cord. It was engraved with a single word, McCullough asterisk. He tied it discreetly to the underside of the cradle. This isn't a brand, he said. It's a marker. If you ever have to leave in a hurry, if you take this with you, anyone who knows that name will help you. It's good in most territories west of the Missouri. He was giving them a token in a secret economy of grace, a network of people who understood that survival was a collective act. Sarah, who had been silent, spoke up. "You've given us too much. We can't accept this." Thomas put his hat on. "You already have. The moment you opened that door, you accepted it. Now the debt is on the ledger, and the only way to clear it is to live, to survive this winter, to have another child if that's what you want, to be the people who answer the next knock on the door." He shook Henry's hand, nodded to Sarah, and left. The journey back to his ranch was a solitary reflection. He thought of Alina, of the daughter he never knew. He realized that for 5 years, he had been preserving his grief like a museum piece. In giving away the cradle, in fighting for these strangers, he hadn't erased that loss. He had simply made room for something else to exist alongside it. Back at the McCullough ranch, his hands, Elias and Joseph, greeted him with relieved fury. "We were 2 days from mounting a search," Elias barked. Thomas simply handed them the reins and said, "There's a family on the Silver Creek claim. The husband's a carpenter. Come spring, we're hearing him to rebuild the line shack, and we're stocking it double." The brothers exchanged a look. They understood. The ledger had been opened. Meanwhile, at the homestead, Sarah and Henry faced the new normal. The wolf carcass frozen in the snow was a daily reminder of the line between life and death. But Thomas's visit had changed the equation. They weren't just surviving, they were fulfilling a contract. They worked with a renewed, almost frantic purpose. Henry improved the lean-to, building a proper door and reinforcing the walls. Sarah planned a garden for the spring, using the empty bean sacks to sketch plots on the floor. But the wilderness was not done testing them. A week after Thomas left, Henry developed a fever. The exhaustion, the exposure, the stress, it all crashed down on him. He took to his bed, shivering violently. Sarah's new terror was medical. She had no remedies, no knowledge. She remembered Thomas's words about the line shack, but it was 2 miles through wolf-haunted snow, and she had never traveled alone. This was the frontier's ultimate trap for women, immobilizing dependency. For 2 days, she nursed Henry with snowmelt and cloths, watching him worsen. On the 3rd morning, his breathing grew ragged. Sarah made her decision. She bundled herself in every piece of clothing she owned, took the pistol, and set out on foot for the ridge, following the map Thomas had drawn. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was deep, the cold vicious. She fell repeatedly. Once she saw a wolf watching her from a distance. She fired the pistol into the air and it slunk away. By the time she stumbled over the ridge and saw the small, sturdy line shack, her hands and feet were numb. Inside, she found Thomas's cache, tins of food, a medical kit with basic laudanum and bandages, extra ammunition, and a note: "Take what you need. Leave what you can. Tell the next one." She took the medical kit and, fortified by the discovery, made the even harder return trip. The laudanum broke Henry's fever. He survived. But the incident had proven Thomas's second, darker point. The safety net was only as strong as the person willing to crawl through the snow to reach it. Sarah had done that. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a full partner in the survival equation. As February turned to March, the snows began to thaw. The first sign of the outside world was not a person but a letter. It came via a circuit-riding preacher who'd stopped at the McCullough ranch. Thomas had paid him to check on the Silver Creek claim. The letter was brief. "Hope this finds you well. The line shack is yours to use. I have work for Henry when he's able. Expect me in April. T. McCullough." It was a lifeline cast across the melting snow. Henry, now recovered, read the letter and then looked at his wife at their cabin at the oak cradle that now held firewood. "We're going to make it," he said. It wasn't a question. But the thaw brought another, more insidious danger. The creek, fed by melting snow, swelled and overflowed its banks. The homestead, built too close to the water in their initial rush, was threatened. Floodwaters seeped into the cabin, ruining a portion of their precious food stores. They were forced to move everything to the higher ground of the lean-to and sleep there, crowded with the horses. They were damp, cold, and facing ruin from an element they thought had passed. As they huddled in the dark, listening to the rush of the engorged creek, Sarah had a chilling thought. The frontier didn't just attack with blizzards and wolves. It attacked with water. It attacked with isolation. It attacked with statistics. And just when you thought you'd beaten one form of it, another rose up to take its place. The test was never over. The only question was whether the help would arrive before the next disaster struck. And as the muddy water swirled around the posts of their home, they had no way of knowing if Thomas McCullough's network of care could stretch far enough to save them from a flood. The floodwaters didn't recede in hours. They rose for 2 days. Sarah and Henry watched from the sodden lean-to as the creek, now a roaring brown serpent, swallowed their garden plot, then lapped at the cabin's doorstep. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they debated a desperate trek to the lined shack with what little they could carry, they heard it again, the sound that had become the anthem of their salvation. The squeal of wagon wheels, the snort of horses, and a familiar voice calling through the drizzle, "Hello, the house." "Need a carpenter." Thomas McCullough had not come alone. Behind his wagon rode Elias and Joseph on horseback, and a second wagon driven by a man from Bismarck, a sawmill owner Thomas had dragged out of bed, promising immediate payment in gold. Thomas had been monitoring the spring thaw from his ranch, knowing the creek's behavior. When the warm rain continued, he'd mobilized his small company without being asked. The mutual aid network wasn't reactive, it was predictive. They worked with a furious, coordinated efficiency born of frontier necessity. The sawmill man assessed the standing timber on the higher ground behind the cabin. Henry, weak but determined, directed the moving of their belongings. Thomas and his men, using ropes and muscle, physically lifted and dragged the oak cradle, the table, the bed to dry ground. They salvaged what food remained. Then they did the unthinkable. They dismantled the cabin itself, log by log, moving them up the slope to a new foundation Elias had already staked out. Within a week, a new, better cabin stood 30 yards from the old site, on ground that would never flood. It was larger, with a proper stone hearth and a real window. The sawmill man left with a heavy purse and a promise of future business. Elias and Joseph returned to the ranch. Thomas stayed behind with Henry and Sarah, helping them chink the new walls, rebuild their furniture, and replant their hope. One evening, as they sat outside the new cabin watching the sunset paint the retreating floodplain, Sarah spoke the question that had been hanging in the air since Christmas. "Thomas, why, truly, you've given us everything. You've risked your life more than once, for people you didn't know." Thomas was quiet for a long time. He poked the small fire they'd built. "When Alina and Mary died," he said slowly, "the world didn't stop. The sun rose, the cattle needed feeding. Men in town still joked about the weather. It felt like a betrayal. My grief was this enormous, silent thing inside me, and the world just went on like it hadn't happened." He looked up at them. "Coming here that night, seeing your pain, it was the first time my grief felt useful. It wasn't just a weight I carried. It was a tool. I knew what that silence in your cabin sounded like. And I knew that the only thing that had ever made a dent in mine was when one person, my foreman at the time, just showed up and started splitting wood for me. Didn't say a word about my loss. Just split wood for 3 days straight." He was describing grief not as a private pathology, but as a shared landscape. His own suffering had given him a map to navigate theirs. His actions weren't charity, they were translation. He was translating his solitary loss into communal survival. With the new cabin secure, Thomas made good on his other promise: work. Henry was a skilled carpenter, and Thomas's ranch had years of deferred maintenance. Henry began riding out to the McCullough spread twice a week, repairing barns, building new corrals, crafting furniture. He was paid not just in cash, but in barter: a milk cow, seed grain, a breeding pair of pigs. The economic transfusion was immediate and life-saving. Sarah, meanwhile, transformed. The woman who had knelt before an empty cradle was gone. In her place was a formidable frontier partner. She managed the new livestock, expanded the garden using seeds Thomas provided, and even learned basic blacksmithing from Joseph to repair tools. She and Henry were no longer clinging to survival. They were building an asset. In the summer of 1883, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. The news was met not with unbridled joy, but with a solemn, fierce determination. This time, they were not alone. Thomas's ranch housekeeper, a tough Irish woman named Bridget who had assisted in more births than the local doctor, made regular visits to check on Sarah. Supplies were prepositioned. A plan was in place. The baby, a healthy girl they named Alina Mary, for Thomas's wife and daughter, was born in March of 1884 without complication. The oak cradle, scrubbed and polished, held a living child for the first time. Thomas was named godfather. At the small christening in the new cabin, attended by Thomas, his hands, and a few other homesteaders who had slowly become neighbors, Henry made a speech. "This child," he said, his voice thick, "she has 3 parents. And she has this whole house of people who kept her parents alive long enough to meet her." The story of Thomas's Christmas Eve journey and everything that followed became local legend, then something more. It became a blueprint. Other ranchers, hearing the tale, began to quietly check on isolated homesteads after hard storms. The preacher who carried mail began to function as an informal news network, relaying word of needs. The line shack caches Thomas had inspired began to appear on other spreads, maintained by a loose, unspoken agreement. But the true test of the system came 3 years later, in the brutal winter of 1887. A devastating blizzard, later called the schoolchildren's blizzard for the many who died caught outdoors, swept across the plains. At the McCullough Ranch, Thomas and his men were battling to save cattle. At the homestead, now a prosperous small farm, Sarah and Henry were secure in their sturdy cabin with 3-year-old Alina and a new baby boy, Thomas Henry, in the oak cradle. The storm passed, leaving epic drifts. A week later, a rider stumbled into Henry's farmyard half frozen. He was a homesteader from 15 miles further west, a Swede named Larson. His wife had just given birth in the storm. They had no fuel left and the baby was failing. He had heard from a man who heard from a man about the people on Silver Creek who might help. Without hesitation, Sarah packed provisions, medicine, food, cloth. Henry hitched their now strong wagon. They loaded it with firewood and their own milk goat. They did not bring the oak cradle, it was in use, but Henry did something else. He went to his workbench and carved a small, smooth plaque of pine. On it, he burned a single word, Silver Creek *. He gave it to Larson. "Show this if you need more help down the line," he said, echoing Thomas's lesson perfectly. They saved Larson's family, and in doing so, they completed the circuit. The aid that had flowed into them had now flowed out with interest. The McCullough tag had spawned a Silver Creek token. The network was reproducing. Thomas McCullough lived to see the frontier close. He saw the railroads come, the towns grow, the mortality rates slowly fall. He never remarried, but he became a singular figure in the territory, a man known not for his wealth in cattle, but for his wealth in loyalty. He died in 1905, quiet in his bed. At his funeral, hundreds came, including a prosperous farmer and carpenter named Henry, his wife Sarah, and their grown children. The oak cradle had its own journey. It held all of Sarah and Henry's children. When Alina married, it was passed to her. She used it for her own children. During the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, when Alina's family was forced to migrate west, they took the cradle. The metal asterisk McCullough tag, still tied beneath it, opened doors, secured loans, found them help in California from the grandchildren of men Thomas had once aided. And here is the final surprising detail. That cradle exists today. It sits in the living room of a history teacher in Portland, Oregon, Alina's great-granddaughter. She knows the whole story. And on the underside, alongside the worn metal tag, is a second, smaller plaque, the pine one Henry carved for Larson that was eventually returned to the family as a totem. 2 markers from 2 different moments of crisis, bound together in one object. This is the real legacy of the frontier. Not the solitary hero, but the chain of care. Not the dramatic gunfight, but the silent wagon ride through a blizzard. The story we started with, a grieving mother, an empty cradle, a stranger's knock, was not an anomaly. It was the system working as designed. A design built not by governments, but by people who understood that the only way to defend against a statistic like 1 in 4 was to make sure no one ever had to face it alone. The cradle, the tag, the shared memory. These were the tools of a different kind of engineering. They built a world where grief could become a bridge, where loss could be converted into fuel for survival, and where the most dangerous place in America could be transformed, one act of stubborn, reckless compassion at a time. So what does an oak cradle from the Dakota Territory in 1882 have to do with you and me today? Everything. Because while we don't face the same statistical terror of losing a child, we are living in a new kind of wilderness, one of digital isolation, of fragmented communities, of polarization that teaches us to see our neighbors as strangers, or worse, as threats. The physical frontier is closed, but the human frontier, the space between one person's suffering and another's capacity to help, is always open. We have replaced blizzards with burnout, wolves with economic anxiety, and the empty cradle with 100 different modern silences. The question isn't whether we face hardship. The question is whether we've let our tools for building connection atrophy. Thomas McCullough, Sarah, and Henry didn't have social media to rally a community. They had something more powerful, proximity and the moral imperative that comes with it. When the news of a loss traveled 70 miles, it carried with it an implicit responsibility for anyone who heard it. Today, news of 1,000 tragedies scrolls past us every hour, and the very scale can paralyze us into inaction. We've mistaken awareness for obligation, and in doing so, we've downgraded the radical, local, tangible act of showing up. But the blueprint is still there. It's in the mutual aid networks that formed during the pandemic, delivering groceries to the elderly. It's in the community fridges on city street corners. It's in the simple, unheralded decision to check on the new family down the street, or to bring a meal to a friend after a loss. These are the modern equivalents of the wagon ride through the blizzard. They are the quiet, sustaining forces that build a livable world beneath the noisy surface of history. The story of the cradle is a reminder that resilience is not an individual trait. It is a network. It is a fabric woven from countless threads of unrecorded kindness. Our most dangerous modern myth is the idea that we are self-made, that we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Thomas McCullough knew better. You are pulled up by the hands of others, and you repay that debt by becoming a pair of hands for someone else. Look around your own life. Who is in your 70-mile radius? Who needs the simple, tangible equivalent of firewood, food, and a beautifully made cradle? The opportunity is not to recreate the past, but to resurrect its principle, that our shared vulnerability is our greatest source of strength. We tell these stories not to live in the past, but to recover a piece of our own humanity. To remember that before we had systems, we had each other. And in many ways, that is still the only system that never truly fails. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of these hidden threads of connection, then hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you're telling the algorithm that these stories matter, that history isn't just about wars and politics, but about the quiet courage of everyday people choosing kindness in a hard world. I'm here to keep unearthing these forgotten blueprints for living. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.